morning, everyone, and welcome to our spring conference. We're so delighted that you took the time out of your busy schedule. I know many of you are just wiped out from this semester and the whole COVID thing. And so I think it speaks so much about your dedication and your professionalism to make the time to be with us this morning. We really, really appreciate that you joined our little community here. For the next speaker, I know you enjoy Justin. We have a wonderful opportunity here to get on board with the latest thinking in our field about anti-racism, something that we've all been thinking about since the time we were little, but the idea of being able to articulate our values and our thinking to our students and create meaning with our students on this topic is critical, I think, at this time. We at the board level feel that it's critical to approach these topics. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Mr. Gerald is an adult educator and a doctoral student at the City University of New York, Hunter College. He's currently pursuing an EDD in instructional leadership, and his scholarship focuses on language education, racism, and whiteness. And he lives with his wife, young son. I don't know the name of his dog, but he's got a doggie. And they live in New York. And he hopes that you will join him on his journey or our journey toward decoding and decentering whiteness in language teaching. In his abstract, he wrote that it's called Worth the Risk. Decentering whiteness in English language teaching is a discussion. Today's discussion will be focused on his 2020 article in the BC TEAL, T-E-A-L journal, and its implications for the field in language instruction. It begins with a short presentation today on important terminology regarding racism and whiteness, and he will move into arguments about how to decenter whiteness in the field of language teaching. And this will be followed by a short question and answer session, which will be about 15 minutes. So as he's speaking, if you could just maybe with a pen or a paper, just write down your questions and then save them for the last 15 minutes. I think that might be less intrusive for him as he's speaking, getting his thoughts together, and then we can have that dedicated 15 minutes to ask him whatever questions are percolating in your mind. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you JPB Gerald.
Okay, thank you. As far as the Q&A and the thing is going, I'm going to put folks, I know Melissa said she was going to allow me to be a co-host or something. Because I'm going to make you all have a discussion amongst yourselves first, and then we're going to come back together. So we'll get there when we get there. But I'm going to talk for 30, 35 minutes, and then we're going into breakouts like we've done in many a Zoom over the past year and a half. And then we're going to come back together and sort of distill what the discussions were. And I'm going to try and bounce through all of the breakouts to see how the discussions go. We'll get there when we get there, but that's just how it's going to work. If you do want to, if you have thoughts during it, yeah, it's better if you write it down or hold on to it. If you put it in the chat, I'm just not going to see it because I'm going to be looking at my screen. So put it there if you want to. I'm just not going to be able to see it. But we will have plenty of time to discuss this stuff. If you, I would say went to, but there's no went to. If you viewed Big TEASOL this year, a version of this was recorded, so it wasn't live there. So if you saw that, well, you know what I'm going to say. But the difference is you actually get to talk about it with me this time and with each other. And that's sort of the point there. And I've changed every time I do this. I've done this a bunch of times. Every time I do this, I change a little bit. So it's never going to be exactly the same. That's the thing about things being live. Okay, a little bit about me. I started my career in South Korea. If folks could mute themselves, I hear some coughing or something, I don't know. I started my career in South Korea, taught for 2 years. And at the end of that time, I realized I didn't know what I was doing. So I came back to get a master's, got it at the New School in 2012. I did various adult teaching English jobs around New York. And then I got a job at a nonprofit where I was managing an adult education department. And then I got the job I have now, which is not in language teaching, but because I just, it seemed appealing to me. And honestly, I think I made a mistake, but pays the bills. Now I'm getting a doctorate, and my focus originally was going to be on something very granular. Like I know that a lot of community education programs, especially language programs, a lot of them are free and the attendance is bad, right? People sign up and they leave. So I said, if I could fix that, right? If I could, find a way, what's this thing I could do to improve attendance at these like free or low cost programs? And I'll be the guy. People are going to come to me like, Justin, fix my program. This will be great. And then I started doing the research into why the programs were poorly attended. And I assumed, like all of you probably might to some extent, that, well, like there's logistical things. They didn't get childcare. It's far away, those sort of things. But in the research, that didn't appear to be the case, right? There's not that much research on this because when people leave programs, they're hard to find. But some of the articles I read, a lot of the time is that the teachers were not actually being respectful of the students. I didn't say nice, I said respectful. And it started to coalesce with the general research on like, students of color do better when they have teachers of color. So then I went down a rabbit hole and I came up with this after a couple of things. And you'll see where I'm going once we get into it. So I'm going to share my screen now and we'll go from there. Okay. You should be able to see it now. I have captions on. They are not perfect because, whatever. I wish they were better, but I think it's important to try to put captions on there. I do talk pretty fast. So anyway, Worth the Risk Towards Decentering Whiteness in English Language Teaching is the name of the article and the presentation. My professor told me at some point that you should change the name of a presentation every time you give it so that you can put it on your CV separately. And that is some academic nonsense. That's the name of the article, so that's the name of the presentation. Anyway, I live on Munsell Lenape / Canarsie land, which is better known as Queens, New York. I bring that up not just to make a land acknowledgement, but to point out that at least in this country and in many countries, the English language has always been a tool of oppression and erasure, dating back from how the indigenous and the enslaved were forcibly assimilated and forced to learn the language. So that's our prologue. That's how we get into this. That's before we even have an industry, right? That's how the language is coming here. So this is the agenda for today. I'm going to do what it said in the abstract. We're going to go through some terminology, which you might think has nothing to do with language teaching, but it's related to it. Talk about different words that you probably hear a lot, but you may not be able to tell the difference between the definitions. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the centering of whiteness because I'm talking about decentering it. Well, you got to know what the centering is, what happens because whiteness is centered in our field, what we can do to decenter it, and then we're going to have a discussion, like I mentioned. So first, we're going to start with terminology. I know I'm talking fast. I'll slow down a little bit. But most of the words are on the screen, by the way, so don't worry too much. And this is being recorded. You can go back and watch it. So what do you call people who aren't white? You got some choices. And I'm going to go in a little clockwise from the top here. Do you call people who aren't white non-white? Well, that's not incorrect, right? It's not false. It's not offensive. But you're defining people by the identity group that has the dominance, right? That would be like calling women non-men, right? You could do it, but it's not really the best way to do it, right? To define people by the more powerful group. There are times when it might be appropriate, but I would say it's best to avoid it. Not that it is necessarily harmful, but that's not the best, right? Especially because it's best not to lump everybody together. Now, if you must lump everybody together who isn't white, then you have POC and BIPOC. For those who don't know, POC is people of color, BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, people of color. Now, the second one has had a lot of discussion lately, and whatever your feelings on that term, because some Black people and Indigenous people think that it's separating them from other people of color. Some people think that, especially with the anti-Asian violence that's going on, you're just saying that Asians don't experience racism, et cetera, et cetera. So you can feel how you want to feel. I'm just telling you what it means. I do think the originality of POC was a term of solidarity among people of color. POC was created by people of color in the 1970s, and they were using that as an alternative to the outdated colored people. Right? You see, what's the difference is because we chose it, right? So POC, if you must refer to everybody who isn't white in one group, use that one. That's fine. But I would say it's better to be specific if you can. If you're talking about Black people, you should say Black people, right? At the bottom here, you have minoritized. Now, minoritized is a good word, and you may or may not have seen this one in the literature or in discussions. You don't see it in the newspaper because the newspaper is 20 years behind. But minoritized, you will, at least in New York, on the subway, you'll see women in minority-owned businesses, right? Women in minority-owned businesses, right? Stop saying minority. What's wrong with minority? Well, minority refers to, for example, a numerical minority, right? There are fewer of this group of people in a place. And who could be angry at math, right? That's just math. But it takes out how the minoritization happened, right? Nothing is an accident in terms of where people live, for example, right? You know, if you want to think about the indigenous, for example, if you just say the indigenous are a minority, then you are ignoring how that happened, right? It's the same thing with a lot of places where Black people are a numerical majority but don't have the power. If you remember the entire controversy, it was the nonsense controversy, but when they were trying to certify the state totals in Michigan, and there were 4 people in this very long meeting, a lot of people were watching on YouTube. It was 4 white people arguing about Black people's votes, right? So Black people had less power, but they are the numerical minority in Detroit. So therefore, that's an example of minoritization. You can't just call Black people in Detroit a minority. They're not the numerical minority, but they don't have as much power, so they're minoritized. The only reason I wouldn't always use minoritized for race is that you can be minoritized and it has nothing to do with race. You can be minoritized and be certain religions. You can be minoritized and be certain genders or sexualities, etc. So if you want to speak about race and minoritization, you might say racially minoritized. Marginalized is very similar. This one is older. So this is where the newspaper is. They'll say marginalized maybe. There's nothing wrong with marginalized. It's just similar to minoritized. It refers to more than race and racism, right? You can obviously be marginalized and be queer. You can obviously be marginalized and be a woman, right? These things are broader than race and racism. So if I'm going to speak broadly about the entire group of people who aren't white, I tend to prefer to use the word racialized. Now, racialization has 2 definitions. There's one that means like we were having a discussion and the discussion became racialized. This is to say it took on a topic of race. That's fine. That's not what I mean though. Racialized means that your status, your racial status depends on your context, right? Because it's all determined by the dominant group. The dominant group, which in not every place is white, right? In certain places it's not majority white people, have determined who is of various races and who is of the dominant race. So when I say racialized, I mean the people who have been categorized as Black, Asian, etc., right? And it depends because someone, for example, if you're in a certain part of Europe, Greek people might be considered racialized in certain places, but then if you come to the United States, like that's not quite the same. So it really depends on the context and so forth. And I think that racialized is a good word to describe this. I bring all of this up to talk about how this is a system, right? This is not people being mean to each other. It's a system. And that system, of course, is racism. So, fun topic. Racism, for those who don't know, and I would hope that you know, but you never know, is racial discrimination plus societal oppression. Anyone can experience the former. For example, I could tell you I don't want to have any white friends. That's not very nice. I'm not actually going to say that. It's just an example. But that's not societal oppression because I am one person and I am not anyone's boss. Or I'm not the boss of my friends. Only certain groups can experience the latter and the former together, right? It's both of these things together. Societal oppression doesn't necessarily have to do with race and racism, right? But you put racial discrimination and societal oppression together, and that's the system of racism. Now, there is a very academic argument about who can be racist, right? Can racialized groups be racist? I don't really care. I know that everyone can choose to perpetuate racism or choose not to perpetuate racism. And that's not the same thing as going up to someone and shouting a slur in their face, right? I want you to forget about that, basically, right? That doesn't matter. We see that happening a lot, but that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like choosing to move to a place where everyone looks like you because you think the schools are better there, and then all of a sudden your kids' friends all look like them, right? That's perpetuating racism. Anyway, there's many forms of racism. There's anti-Black racism, There's anti-Asian racism, we know this, right? Anti-Muslim racism, which I know Islam is not a race, but the way that the language around Islam is used is very similar to other types of racism. And I defer to Muslim scholars on this, and I consider it part of it. So sometimes you might want to be specific when you're talking about the type of racism. Specificity is important in these discussions. And one thing I should mention, never say race when you mean racism. For example, every time you read a story about a police officer shooting someone unarmed, etc., they might say that the person was killed because of their race. No, they were killed because of racism. Nothing has ever happened to anybody because of their race. It has only ever happened to them because of racism. Anyway, anti-Blackness is another way of saying anti-Black racism. So this is oppression of Blackness, Black people, Black languages. When I say Black languages, I also mean the way that Black people use languages, including English, right? If any of you are old enough to remember the Ebonics controversy from the 90s, like that was anti-Blackness, right? Black bodies, right? Black hair, that sort of thing, that's all one system. And it's not different from racism. It's a subset of racism. It's a certain type of racism. I'm only pulling this out because sometimes people get uncomfortable saying the word Black, and I'm going to say it. This is one of the most historically reliable paths to whiteness for people who were in liminal positions. So 120 years ago, or maybe in the late 19th century, especially in like Philadelphia and also in New York and Boston, right? Irish and Italian immigrants amassed power becoming police. And of course, the police and anti-Blackness are best friends. There are other European immigrant homeowners who were allowed to be part of the growing suburbs throughout the 20th century. Those suburbs, of course, engaged in redlining and keeping Black people out. And if the people decided they wanted to be white, they had to help the Black people stay out. So if you are able to, engage in anti-Blackness, then you might have a better chance of being accepted within whiteness. So white supremacy, this doesn't need much of a definition. It's the idea that whiteness is superior to other racial groups. But I want to contrast it with white nationalism, right? Just saying that you think that white people are better than other groups is white supremacy, I guess. But white nationalism is trying to create a white ethno-state, right? A country for only white people. That's when they are trying to get rid of even legal immigration. Right? That's building walls for no reason. That's leaving the European Union for no reason, right? That's all white nationalism, right? And, things that, for example, former presidents are advocating. I say all of this, though, to point out what is whiteness, right? Well, whiteness, let's be clear, if we were around and had cameras 2,000 years ago, or 2,045 years ago, right? We would have probably thought that Julius Caesar was white, but we didn't use these words back then, or they didn't use those words back then. They maybe described skin color as different colors, but this whole concept of whiteness that we have now was really codified in about the 16th century, and it was created to be supreme. Right? This was a group of people who over time became exempt from colonialism and exempt from slavery. And it's like these things at the beginning, they were messy. There were some white slaves, that people bring this up and stop doing that. And there were some people who were colonized who were white, but over time it became that there was whiteness, and then there was the other people who were deserving of their exploitation. So which is the point, is to say that there is no functional difference between whiteness, and when I say whiteness, I mean the system, not white people. There's nothing you can do about that, and not people with light colored skin, all right? Hashtag not all white people. There's no functional difference between the system of whiteness and white supremacy, because whiteness can't exist if it is not considered supreme. So now the actual subject, this, what we as ELT professionals are truly promising to students, even without understanding that we are doing so, is the chance to get closer to whiteness. However, whiteness is an ideology that depends upon exclusion and supremacy. So this promise is doomed to be broken, and no racialized speaker of English, or user, because this might be writing, can truly become white just by improving their English skills, right? We'll go into what that means and how, and the racial linguistics of it over time. But that is all a preamble into talking about what's actually in my article. So the centering of whiteness in ELT. I don't know if you can see the top of the screen, sorry. It says ulterior motives at the top. Anyway, so Kendi in How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I'm sure some of you read during all of those book clubs last summer, referred to racism and capitalism as conjoined twins. And he wrote that upon their mutual codification in the 16th century, which is what I just said, these newborns looked up with tender eyes to their ancient siblings of sexism, imperialism, ethnocentrism, and homophobia, which is to say, obviously, whiteness and racism were not the beginning of oppression and cruelty, right? Obviously, as he's talking about, people were conquering other countries, enslaving people, harming people since humans have existed, really, or since countries have existed. But the particular axis of oppression that we think of now was created then alongside capitalism because they needed a group of people who were going to be more vulnerable to the excesses of capitalism. So basically, my point is you can't successfully argue against the whiteness in English language teaching without arguing against the profit motive in the field, right? You know, the publishers, right? The way that, you know, where the money's coming from, because these two things are not separate, they're not unrelated, and they're not accidents. So this necessarily requires arguing against our adherence to capitalism. Now, this is not like a specifically Marxist presentation. I'm not really an economist. You go figure that out for yourself. But we do have to understand that you can't get rid of whiteness without getting rid of capitalism, and that's just something we have to contend with. So to uncritically support profit-centric goals in our field, even in public schools, because public schools buy materials too, as justification for racially oppressive policies, and I really should just change that to racist, and practices, is to help whiteness remain in control. But when I point that out, and the reason I started doing this research and these talks is because as soon as I brought up whiteness, people got very uncomfortable. And it also makes people uncomfortable that the field promotes these destructive values, because I don't want to think that I'm part of something harmful. You don't want to think that you might be part of something harmful either. It is understandable to be discomforted by these things. So what happens? Oh, that did not look as big when I look at the slide. Anyway, what happens is, and I'm not super hyped on white fragility anymore. I read it a couple of years ago and I cited it in this article, so it's in the presentation. But the point is not that she's wrong, it's that Black people had said what she said first. But whatever, it's in the article. Anyway, people get very defensive and you know, they want to distance themselves, they get angry, whatever. If you're feeling that now, okay. But I suspect when people come to my presentations, they're not likely to feel that way. It's more when you go and try to talk about these things with other people, you should expect that. And then when people actually get over those feelings, though, they say, I want to fix it. I'm going to go and I'm going to solve these problems myself. And that's how you end up doing the white savior thing, right? That's how you end up saying, well, no, I'm going to go and I'm going to fix everything because, et cetera. So don't do that either. And then there's my idea, the altruistic shield, right? This was I have a couple of articles, and the first one was about the altruistic shield in language teaching. This is the idea that, and it's not just language teaching, but that's what we're talking about. People will use their profession itself, a profession that is seen as pro-social. For example, language teaching is seen as a socially good profession, right? Or social work, or any kind of education, or medicine, as basically saying like, no, I can't be complicit in a harmful, racist, etc. system because what I do is good for the world, right? And so therefore the profession becomes a shield, and it's much harder to get around like, how can I be doing something that's good for the world, but also be part of something that's perpetuating harm? And it's hard to deal with. I mean, the way I deal with it is by trying to make things better. So, you know. So what happens because whiteness is centered? Well, here's a couple of quotes from the article. ELT, race and language, are also components of what is called the aesthetic labor of teachers. To look good is to be white, while to sound right entails speaking an inner circle variety of English. If you don't remember the inner circle, this is what I learned in like my first week of grad school. The inner circle is like US, UK, Canada, etc. Those countries, right? So if you don't sound like you're from these places, and you don't look a certain way, and we know what it means to look a certain way, then therefore you have to work a whole lot harder to be seen as equal as an educator, especially in this field. That's what it means, the aesthetic labor. And then another quote, I recall a complaint made by a parent to the clerk in 2009 that her child was being taught by a teacher of Indian descent. The teacher, who was born and raised in the UK, was a native speaker of English, yet was perceived to be someone who speaks quote unquote with an accent because of her appearance, right? They've done studies on this, that two people saying the same things will be seen as sounding different, even if they literally sound the same, because one person looks one way and one person looks another way, right? This is all in the whole racial linguistic ideologies, which I'll get into a little bit later. And of course, I want to point out everybody has an accent. There's nobody who doesn't have. You have I have an accent. We all have accents, right? But this idea that certain accents make people unintelligible and certain accents are really easy to understand is a harmful one. So that's what happens for racialized teachers, right? The field becomes much more inhospitable, and you have to work against these things. And also, sometimes when you bring this up to your white colleagues, they don't listen to you. So for racialized students, well, the linguistic marginalization of students of color serves only to reify our extant status quo. And when addressed, we deflect and distract. We raise that altruistic shield that I mentioned to avoid addressing the racial disparities in our field, right? The language of our students, whether it's English only policies or things where we think that if the student can be understood, we're still correcting them left and right. This keeps our status quo in place, right? And Matthias explained, she was talking about teacher education in general, but it's not any less true in language education. Since the teaching force, curricula, policies, and teacher education pipeline are white dominant, the context for repressed forms of linguistic violence is maintained. If disrupted, white performative recurrences of anger, avoidance, guilt, dismissal, and repression stifle race knowledge. When you look at all these articles, including that article that she cites, that she's wrote, that I cited, and similar ones about teacher training, whenever people bring up anything about whiteness, the teachers would like to pretend that it has nothing to do with them, or they'll fall back on their ethnicity and they'll say, well, I'm not white, I'm Italian, etc. So it's very difficult to get people to actually, look at these things directly. And this is really harmful to the students overall. So what can we do about it, right? What is the work? Well, we need structural changes. So pausing for a second to say that I don't really think the journal system needs to survive all that much longer anyway. Well, at least as it is, because it doesn't make sense for these things to be locked up and cost $30 for like a single day. And it takes 9 years for the research to get out there. So if something's happening now, you're not going to find out about it until 2028 and so forth. So it's just, yeah, it's a mess. But if we're going to have journals and people are going to graduate from school needing to have been in journals, right? Then we need a place specifically for this. And when I say a place for this, I mean not a special issue of the TESOL journal that was actually a compiled list of articles from the previous 5 years. Good job, folks. But I mean an actual place where, because when I went and I looked up articles to write this article, I was in, the education space, I was in the race space, I was in the language space, I was all over the place, right? Language itself, it doesn't really want to grapple with racism that often. If it mentions racism, it's very oblique, or it's sort of offhand and something like that. When maybe not now, maybe because some people have been taking this mantle up, but like when I wrote this article and I Googled the topic of the article, like after it came out, it was just me showing up, right? And it shouldn't be the case that I'm one of the few people who's written this article. And article's like 7 pages. So, anyway, all white panels, if you are white and you're invited to be on a panel, find out who's on the panel. You should not be sitting on all white panels, right? If it's literally 2 of you and you wrote a paper together, whatever. But like sometimes they have panels with a bunch of people on them, and the panel doesn't necessarily have to do with race or racism, and that's fine. But like you shouldn't be, you should not participate in that. And you should talk to the organizers when you see that. And I'm talking about when you get back out into the world and we're going to physical conferences again and everybody's happy to see each other. You can't forget about this, right? We have a chance during this extended pause to reframe the way that these conferences are put together. I'm glad that I'm one of the 3 plenaries or keynotes or whatever today, but like it's also still mostly me talking about whiteness and language teaching. So individual success does not change collective things. I'm not complaining about my own prominence, but I would like others to be doing what I'm doing. Professional orgs, which you are all a part of, or at least, watching something that a professional org is putting on. The boards, the leadership, I guess that's the same thing. Priorities need to explicitly counter racism, right? I know that because I know the person who has this role, every affiliate has to have an advocacy person, right? But advocacy does not necessarily have to deal with racism. It doesn't have to, right? That's not what the word means per se. And I know that until I became the advocacy person for New York State TESOL, which is the role that I have, it was not really what we were doing as an organization here and there. But like I created, I'll talk about that a little bit later. But like the point is, these professional orgs are, for better or worse, where a lot of the language people have to go to amass sort of collective action. And if these professional orgs are not doing this, it's not really going to happen. And let's talk about Big TESOL again, and I keep talking about it, but whatever. When I was on Facebook, which I should never do, but I was on Facebook in January, and Big TESOL posted something about how it was good that the Muslim ban was rescinded, which, yes, good. Everyone got on, like all the comments on there were angry about how shouldn't be talking about politics, shouldn't be talking about politics. Now, that's not Big TESOL's fault. However, if those people are in their membership, because why would you be on their page if not, then Big TESOL has to think about that. And I would say that like, these professional organizations need to take real stands on these things. They might be wrong. It's okay to be wrong, but taking a real stand, the people who are mad are going to be mad whether you take a half and half stance or whether you take a real stance. So professional orgs need to take real stance whenever these things come up. And if you don't have anyone in your professional organization who you feel is good at writing about racism, then you need to bring someone in who's good at that, right? Individual study. So if you're white, and many of you are, I saw the pictures, you need to interrogate your whiteness, right? What does that mean? Where did you grow up? Where are you living now, right? How has it impacted you for better or worse? And in fact, that's what you're going to do in the breakout room. So we'll talk about that in a second. Race and language scholarship. So the racial linguistic ideologies and all of these things that are related to race and language, it needs to be in the canon. Now, just like journals, I'm not sure that canons should be a thing, but if there's going to be a canon, then that should be in there. It should not be the same 6 voices, right? And then interdisciplinary literature, well, the fact is we're all busy, right? If we are simply looking for research or whatever to improve our own practice, then most of the time we're probably going to look at language stuff. Fine. But then if you really want to see what's being said about this, you're going to have to take the extra time to look outside of the language field, because the language field isn't really where it needs to be on this stuff yet. So go look at the race and education stuff. Go look at just the race stuff in general. I had to look at psychology to think about some of these things, right? And the work that I'm doing on like disability and racism, like I had to go look at that research, right? You're just going to have to take the extra step outside of the field to really do that. So the conclusion before we all are set off to talk to each other. So I said all of this, I started doing this presentation and I started actually doing the work, right? Yeah, I write these articles and I have a podcast and all that, and you can listen to it and so forth. But like, I do have a class, so people can take that if they want. It's not specifically about language teaching, but it's about decentering whiteness in people's organizations, because I think a lot of I don't think decentering whiteness in people's interpersonal interactions is very useful, because that's not really what racism is about. And I'm not an activist in the sense that I'm not in the street. I don't have those skills, so I can't tell you how to take down, entire state governments. That's not really my skill set. But I know how to deal with organizations. So I started actually putting myself out there and trying to help people with that. But more importantly, right now, I'm trying to bring all these state TESOL organizations together. I know one, I guess, past president or whatever of New Jersey is here, right? The people in New York who I've been talking to, and I'm trying to build now with Connecticut. There's your tri-state area, right? Or I guess it's and then Pennsylvania. That's 4 states, whatever. So that we, as state organizations who know what our states need and how racism is affecting, our students in the language field, can build together. Because frankly, I don't think it's going to happen at Big TESOL. I don't think it is. Not in the next decade until the states. It's got to come from below. And we are, as far as, you know, as below as you're going to get as far as these professional organizations. So if you are interested in, you know, working with me on those things, we can talk after this. Now, you are going to talk to each other. I'm going to stop sharing, and then we are going to go into breakout rooms. Those questions you should think to yourself, and we will send you to breakouts. So breakout rooms. I am going to create, how many of you are there? 40-ish. I'm going to put questions in the chat right now, and you should answer those questions in the breakout rooms. And I'm going to bounce through the breakout rooms. It is 11:50. We still have 25 minutes. So you're going to be in the breakout rooms for about 15, and then we're going to come back for the final 10. All right, so let me get my questions together. Hold on, we'll have to close the slideshow. And all right, those are your questions. Go talk. The board you're going to, so go. I see some of the board is still here. You're gonna talk to.
I'm looking at the question first so I can help facilitate. I'm just going to take a screenshot of it.
Oh, I mean, it should be visible once you go in there because I put it out here.
Visible in the breakout room?
Yeah, because I put it out here. Everyone should be able to see the chat that's out here.
In the breakout room, I can do that?
Yeah, well, go see. If you can't, then we'll find out. So. Okay, so I think everybody is back here. I'm not sure why that screen is fun. Anyway, so I saw some interesting things in there. I'm gonna pull a couple out. And, you know, there was an interesting, you know, sort of theme I was seeing is that, like, you know, what do we even do if my student comes to me and tells me, like, first of all, well, I don't know, I don't want to hear from a quote unquote non-native speaker, right? Or what do we even do if, like, okay, we individually as teachers are going to respect the way that other people use English, but it's not going to be respected when they go out in the world, right? You know, we can make a change in ourselves, but if our student is still going to be perceived negatively because of the way that they use the language, what do we do about that? I mean, that's why I'm saying that this work is going to take a very long time, right? This pushback is really only like, the pushback against native speakerism is old, but like, pushing back against, questions of standard English standardization is newer. And I think it's really, it's going to take a lot. I can't read all of that right now, but it's going to take a lot of time. And yeah, I see that people keep saying, which seems to be the theme of that thing that was just posted there that I don't have time for, that like they want to hear what the standard accent is. Okay, fine. But there is a difference between a student expressing that and a school only providing that, because what do the teachers who don't sound that way do? They either change the way they speak or they don't get hired, right? And that is simply unjust. So yes, should we expose people to that? Sure, as one of many possible options, right? As not the only good thing, right? And then, all right, so that's all I'm going to say about all of that. Do other people have questions? If they want to do the hand raise thing, we could do that, and we'll go from there. We have about 5 minutes.
I have a question. Hi, this is Helen. Um, Justin, you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that you were interested in finding out reasons why adult learners are absent sometimes from their English language classes, although they need those classes. And would you please tell us a little bit more about what information you were able to come across in this aspect?
Oh, I mean, it's more that like I came across articles where people had done that research, and what happened was that in the articles I'm talking about, the teachers and administrators had assumed that, I see your hand, Mark. The teachers and administrators had assumed that it was logistical, like they didn't get childcare or whatever, the things like that, right? And I'm sure that was the case occasionally. But what the students said when they were interviewed was that like the teachers like didn't do what the students actually, like they didn't, I'm trying to remember exactly what they said because there's some good quotes in the article. I can send you the article if you want. But like the teachers and the administrators didn't respect their autonomy as adults. And it was, they kept assuming they knew less than they knew, that they were less competent than they were, right? They felt that they had been treated as incompetent. Right now, this is one study, how limitations, whatever. And I found that interesting. So then I kept looking at other things, and it fell along with, because the reason I was interested in it, because my class, when I was the manager of that program, and I also taught a class, my class got great attendance, right? And the logistics were no different. It was the same time as the other classes. And I could tell myself, well, I'm just the best teacher in the world. That's not, come on, I'm not going to do that, right? So I wanted to assume it's not just that, but it does seem a little bit, because I was the only teacher of color in the program that I was running, which is something that I should have done something about before I left. And like, there was something that I was doing without realizing what I was doing that was getting them to feel more comfortable in the class from the beginning. So that's, yeah, I can send you, if you email me, I can send you the article that I found, and then I'm sure there's others. But, Mark?
Thank you, Justin, for a very enlightening discourse. I'm Mac Khan, an ESL student, a former ESL student. And I just want to share my experience of learning English in 4 countries, starting with Bangladesh, and then Pakistan, and then UK, and then US. And in this whole journey of learning English, I came across lots of teachers who taught me English. And now I often think about them, and the ones who taught me so very well, these are the ones who always come to my mind. I can easily recall their names. that these were the teachers who taught me English, regardless of their race, color, gender, or anything. And now, the point I'm making is this: as an ESL teacher, I've looked upon them as my teachers, and I really, really value them, especially the ones who addressed my needs, my language needs, what I needed, who spoke to me on a personal level, and who built a good relationship with me. Somehow or the other, even till today, I'm unable to categorize them into races or their genders or their country of origin. That has been my experience as an ESL student. I just wanted to share with you this. If you feel like commenting on it, feel free to do this.
But I actually think that that's important, because you're saying, you as a student, I know you're saying you're a teacher now, but I'm saying, like, when you were a student, you recall the ones who cared the most about you, and I'll put the email in the thing at the end, Tanya. And they were not all necessarily the same race, gender, age, whatever it is, right? They were the ones who cared about you, they were supportive. I think that also shows that it's important for us to, as teachers, have very different people in that classroom as teachers, right? Because it's the most important thing is, are you really supportive of your students? And I don't want to say necessarily that quote unquote non-native teachers are going to be better, or that Black teachers are better, right? It's just that they shouldn't be treated as lesser than what the expectation is. And I'm not saying that you did that, Ma. I'm saying that, like, the industry does that because of some of, a lot of things. We are about to be out of time here, so I'll pause and put the information and in the chat. The information is here. On. Oh, there. I thank all of you for your attention today and your time. I really do hope that my email is there. So if people want to talk to me, if you want to argue with me, don't bother. I'm not arguing with you. I have no interest in that. But if you want to build with me, right, we can build together. I'm really trying to put these sort of state agencies together so that we can really change things, so that, for example, maybe 10, 15 years from now, it's not the case that, okay, maybe every student has been told that the only acceptable accent is certain accents, right? And maybe they come in understanding that there's nothing wrong with their own accent, and they want to add certain forms of the language. They want to learn what standardized American English is, or British, or wherever you are. But they don't want to feel as though the way that they use the language is inferior. So that's really what the point of it is. Yes, I talk about whiteness, but it's really about a lot of things. It's not really about skin color at all. It's about exclusion, inclusion, and justice. All right, folks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Justin. And I think we had some incredibly rich conversation in the breakout rooms. Obviously, I wasn't in all of them, but in ours, we made some deep connections to affective filter and the dignity of the individual student, and being able to relate to students in a very deep and meaningful way, so that their language acquisition process could be helped. And we wanted to just thank Justin so much for joining us today, because it stirs us in new ways to open up our thinking. So it's not just teaching the way we always did with the conventional wisdom. And that's always a good thing when we're challenged to open up our minds and our hearts and think about, giving the relationships in our classroom more dignity. So just looking at the time right now, I did want to remind you that we're going to have another raffle.